The sky burned red as enormous alien warships hovered over Earth's cities. The people of Earth had seen wars before, but nothing like this. These were not just invaders. They were the Zarkun, a race of towering, armored conquerors who had never lost a battle. And leading them was Commander Xelvor, the most feared warrior of their empire. Xelvor stood tall in his dark, metallic armor, glowing with alien energy. His deep, piercing eyes scanned the ruined streets below as his troops marched forward. Buildings had crumbled, roads were broken, and the sound of desperate human resistance filled the air. He had heard stories about humans, weak creatures, soft and fragile. Some Zarkun leaders had even questioned whether Earth was worth conquering. But Xelvor knew better. "This planet fights harder than expected," he muttered, his voice like grinding steel. His second-in-command, Captain Korak, nodded. "They resist, but it is meaningless," Korak said. "Their weapons cannot harm us. Their armies fall within hours." Xelvor smirked beneath his helmet. He stepped forward, the ground shaking slightly beneath his powerful form. A group of human soldiers had taken position in the ruins ahead, firing desperately. Their bullets and missiles struck his indestructible armor and bounced off like tiny pebbles. Pathetic. He raised his plasma blade, its green light crackling, and charged forward. In seconds, the resistance was shattered. The soldiers screamed, some running, some still trying to fight, but none of them stood a chance. One by one, they fell. Xelvor felt no joy in this battle. It was too easy, too predictable. He had fought stronger enemies before. He had destroyed powerful warlords and crushed entire armies. This was not a challenge. As the last of the soldiers fell silent, Xelvor turned to his troops. "Continue forward. Destroy any remaining resistance." His warriors moved ahead, spreading fear through the streets. Xelvor glanced at the ruins around him. Once, this had been a thriving human city. Now, it was little more than rubble. And yet, something felt wrong. A presence, a feeling, a challenge, but from where? Then he saw it. A single human stood among the ruins, staring directly at him. A child. Xelvor frowned. The child couldn't have been older than 10 years old. He had messy brown hair and dirt-streaked clothes. His small fists were clenched at his sides, his face set in a look of defiance. Most humans ran when they saw him. Even their strongest warriors trembled in fear. But this child, he did not move. Xelvor took a step forward, his towering form casting a shadow over the boy. "You are alone, human," he said, his voice deep and commanding. "Kneel before me. Your world belongs to the Zarkun now." The child didn't kneel. He didn't even flinch. Instead, he did something Xelvor never expected. He threw a rock. A simple, small rock. It struck Xelvor's helmet with a soft thunk and bounced harmlessly to the ground. It did no damage. It was no threat. But it shocked him. For a moment, there was complete silence. Even the Zarkun soldiers stopped, confused by what had just happened. Did this tiny, powerless human child just attack a warrior of the greatest empire in the galaxy? Xelvor's hands tightened into fists. "How dare you?" His voice rumbled like distant thunder. The boy, however, did not look afraid. His eyes burned with something strange. Something Xelvor had rarely seen, even in the strongest warriors he had fought. Determination. Before Xelvor could react, the boy slowly lifted his wrist. A strange device was strapped to it, barely bigger than a watch. The boy smiled. He pressed a button. A strange, high-pitched sound wave exploded outward. Xelvor's world shifted. His armor, once unbreakable, glitched. A faint crack appeared along the seams of his gauntlet. He felt something he had never felt before. Weakness. His mind raced. This was impossible. Nothing on Earth should be able to affect his armor. The Zarkun had tested their defenses against every human weapon imaginable. But this child, This tiny, insignificant human child had just done what no soldier on Earth could do. Zelvor stumbled back, his breath coming in sharp gasps. His armor flickered again. The crack grew wider. The boy grinned. Gotcha. For the first time in his life, Commander Zelvor felt something new. Fear. Zelvor's vision flickered as his armor glitched again. The once perfect energy flow around his body now shuddered, and a faint crack on his gauntlet pulsed with weakness. He could feel it, a sensation that was completely alien to him. Weakness. No human had ever made him feel this way before. No weapon had ever even scratched his armor. But now, a child, a mere boy, had done what Earth's armies failed to do. He staggered back. The Zarkun soldiers around him hesitated. Their mighty commander, the warrior who had crushed civilizations, was moving backward, away from a human child. Impossible. Zelvor clenched his fists, forcing himself to ignore the strange sensation in his armor. He took a step forward, towering over the boy once more. "What did you do?" he growled. The boy, Elliot Carter, smirked. His small hand was still on the device strapped to his wrist, a compact sonic disruptor built from captured Zarkun technology. His parents had worked in a top-secret science division, and they had been studying alien tech long before the invasion. Now, their research was being put to use. "I found your weakness," Elliot said, his voice steady. Zelvor's glowing red eyes narrowed. "You are lying. My armor is indestructible." Elliot tilted his head. "Then why is it cracking?" Zelvor looked down. The fracture on his gauntlet had spread. His advanced armor, built by the greatest minds of the Zarkun Empire, was failing. A deep rage bubbled inside him. How could this be happening? The mighty Zarkun brought to this moment by a child. No, this was not possible. With a snarl, he lunged. Elliot jumped back, rolling to the side as Zelvor's massive fist slammed into the ground where he had been standing. The force cracked the pavement, sending dust into the air. But Zelvor wasn't done. He swung again, this time with precision. Elliot barely managed to dodge, but he wasn't fast enough. Zelvor's massive hand snatched his wrist, lifting him off the ground. The disruptor on Elliot's wrist sparked, but the pressure of Zelvor's grip made it difficult to activate again. "Your trick ends here, human," Zelvor growled. His other hand began to glow as he charged an energy blast. Elliot kicked and struggled, but the alien warrior's grip was too strong. He had to think, fast. His free hand darted to his belt, grabbing a small metallic sphere, another device taken from Zarkun Tech Labs. With a quick press of his thumb, it activated. The EMP grenade sent a powerful shockwave through the air. Zelvor's armor shuddered violently. The crack in his gauntlet widened, sending a ripple of weakness through his body. His systems glitched again, and his grip on Elliot loosened just enough. Elliot twisted free, dropping to the ground. He rolled and pressed the disruptor on his wrist again, sending another high-frequency pulse. This time, Zelvor roared in pain. His knees buckled, and for the first time in his life, he felt something he never had before. His own strength failing. The Zarkun soldiers, witnessing their commander's struggle, froze. Their leader, the invincible warrior, was falling to his knees. This was not supposed to happen. Zelvor gasped for breath, his armor feeling heavier than ever. He looked at Elliot with a mix of rage and something else. Something new. Doubt. The boy took a step closer. He was not running. He was not afraid. He was winning. How? Zelvor gritted his teeth. "You are just a child." Elliot crossed his arms. "And yet, I'm standing while you're kneeling." Zelvor clenched his fists. His mind raced. The Zarkun Empire had faced many enemies. Powerful warlords, monstrous creatures, entire species with technology far beyond humanity's. And yet this child had done something no one else could. He had made the Zarkun bleed. The sound of approaching human military forces filled the air. The resistance had seen what was happening. They had witnessed the cracks in Zelvor's armor, and now they had hope. Zelvor looked around. The situation had changed. He was no longer the predator. He was now the prey. The soldiers raised their weapons. They were no longer afraid. "Take him down," one of them shouted. Bullets, plasma rounds, and explosives rained upon Zelvor. Before, they would have been useless. But now, they struck deep. Zelvor let out a mighty roar, refusing to fall. But his armor continued to fail, the cracks spreading like wildfire. He had gone from unstoppable to vulnerable in a matter of minutes. And it was all because of a child. Elliot watched as the once mighty alien stumbled back, his army now hesitant. He took a deep breath. Humanity wasn't weak. And they were just getting started. Zelvor's body shook as he forced himself to stand. His once indestructible armor was now covered in glowing cracks, flickering as its energy failed. The sensation of weakness spread through him like a disease. He had never felt this way before. The mighty Zarkon warlord, the unstoppable force that had conquered entire worlds, was now struggling to stay on his feet. And the worst part, it was because of a human child. Elliot Carter stood a few feet away, watching him carefully. His small hands were still clenched into fists, but his face showed no fear. If anything, he looked confident, like he had already won. The Zarkon soldiers around them hesitated, their weapons still raised but their loyalty shaken. Their commander had never lost before. He had never even been injured. But now, they had seen it with their own eyes. He was falling apart. Zelvor's glowing red eyes locked onto Elliot. "You are just a child," he growled. Elliot smirked. "And yet, you're the one losing." Zelvor let out a deep snarl and clenched his fists. He refused to accept this. He had to end this now. With a sudden burst of strength, he lunged forward, his massive fist swinging toward Elliot. Even weakened, he was still faster and stronger than any human. Elliot's eyes widened. He barely had time to react. The fist slammed into the ground, just inches from where he had been standing. The impact sent shockwaves through the street, shattering the pavement and sending debris flying. Elliot rolled to the side, heart pounding. He wasn't fast enough to dodge again. If Zelvor landed a single hit, it was over. He had to think fast. His fingers reached for the sonic disruptor on his wrist. He had used it twice already, but he didn't know how many more times it could work before the battery died. There was only one way to find out. He pressed the button. Another high-frequency pulse exploded from the device, sending invisible waves through the air. Zelvor froze. His armor glitched violently, sparks flying from his gauntlets and chest plate. The cracks grew wider, and this time, something shattered. A piece of his shoulder armor broke off and hit the ground. Silence fell over the battlefield. The Zarkon soldiers gasped. The human resistance fighters watching from the ruins stared in shock. Zelvor himself was motionless, staring at the broken piece of his armor with disbelief. His indestructible armor, the same armor that had protected him for decades, was now falling apart. The realization hit him like a hammer. He wasn't just losing. He was defeated. Elliot took a cautious step forward. "Looks like your fancy armor isn't so strong after all," he said. Zelvor's hands trembled. His mind raced. How could this be happening? The Zarkon had prepared for every possible threat before invading Earth. They had studied human weapons, tested their own technology, and ensured their armor was impenetrable. So why was it breaking now? Then it hit him. The humans weren't just fighting. They were learning. They had adapted. This child wasn't just lucky. He was using human ingenuity. His people had discovered a way to weaken Zarkon armor, and he had used it perfectly. Zelvor's rage faded. For the first time in his life, he felt something he never expected to feel toward humans. Respect. Elliot took another step forward. "You should leave," he said, "because if you stay here any longer, "You're not going to win." Behind him, the human resistance fighters began to move. Now that they saw their enemy bleeding, their confidence returned. They raised their weapons. Their fear was gone. A soldier in the distance gave the signal. Fire. Bullets, missiles, and plasma blasts filled the air. Zelvor's instincts screamed at him to fight back. But his armor, his greatest weapon, was useless now. The first bullet pierced through his side. The second one struck his leg. Explosions tore through his weakened armor, and for the first time in his life, Zelvor felt pain. He stumbled backward, his vision blurring. His soldiers panicked. "The commander is falling," one of them shouted. "What do we do?" Another cried. Zelvor's mind spun. He could not fight like this. His army was losing morale. If he stayed, he would die here. He had no choice. With a deep, painful snarl, he slammed his fist onto a small device on his wrist. A distress beacon. Within seconds, the Zarkun warships hovering above the battlefield activated their teleporters. Zelvor's body was wrapped in glowing blue energy, and before the final barrage of human firepower could strike him, he vanished. The remaining Zarkun soldiers, seeing their leader retreat, lost all courage. They turned and fled, running back toward their ships. The battle was over. The humans had won. A deafening cheer rose through the ruins as the resistance fighters celebrated. They had fought against an unstoppable enemy, and they had prevailed. Elliot let out a deep breath, watching the last of the aliens retreat into the sky. His plan had worked. Humanity had proved they were not weak. And for the first time, the Zarkun Empire had tasted defeat. The war wasn't over yet, but this was just the beginning. The ruins of the city were silent after the battle. Smoke curled into the sky, rising from the wreckage of destroyed buildings and alien war machines. The air smelled of burning metal and dust, but for the first time in months, it did not smell of defeat. The humans had won. Elliot Carter stood on a broken piece of pavement, looking up at the dark clouds above. His hands were still trembling from the fight, his heart still racing. The impossible had happened. He had defeated Zelvor, the greatest warrior of the Zarkun Empire. But he knew it wasn't over. A hand clapped his shoulder, snapping him out of his thoughts. It was Commander Harris, leader of the local resistance. His gray uniform was torn, and a deep cut ran along his forehead, but his eyes burned with pride. "You did good, kid," Harris said. "Real good." Elliot swallowed and nodded. "We won today," he said, "but they'll be back." Harris sighed, his face darkening. "Yeah," he admitted, "they will." The Zarkun fleet was still in orbit, their massive warships blocking out the sun. They had retreated, but not surrendered. And if Zelvor was still alive, he would return. Stronger, faster, angrier. The ground rumbled, and Elliot turned to see resistance engineers examining the broken pieces of Zelvor's armor. The cracks still glowed faintly, proof that the disruptor had worked. Dr. Helen Carter, Elliot's mother, knelt beside the largest fragment, running a scanning device over it. Her eyes widened as data flashed across her screen. This is incredible," she muttered. Elliot walked over. "What is it?" She looked up, excitement in her eyes. "Your attack didn't just damage his armor," she explained. "It rewrote its energy structure." Elliot frowned. "What does that mean?" Dr. Carter stood, pushing back a loose strand of hair. "It means their technology isn't as perfect as they think. If we analyze this data, we might be able to create weapons that can destroy their armor completely." Harris let out a low whistle. "That's a game changer." But Elliot wasn't convinced. "How long will it take?" Dr. Carter hesitated. "Weeks. Maybe longer." Elliot clenched his fists. Weeks might be too late. The Zarkun would not wait. Meanwhile, aboard the Zarkun warship, Zelvor sat on the cold metal floor of the healing chamber, his hands resting on his knees. His breathing was slow, controlled, but his mind was a storm of rage and confusion. His armor was gone, shattered. The pain of his injuries had faded, thanks to the Zarkon medical machines, but the shame remained. He had lost, not to an army, not to a warlord, but to a human child. It was unacceptable. The chamber door slid open with a hiss, and a tall figure stepped inside. His dark robes flowed around him like shadows, and his glowing yellow eyes held no emotion. It was High Lord Zarkos, ruler of the Zarkon Empire. Zelvor immediately stood, placing his fist over his chest in salute. "My lord," he said, his voice steady. Zarkos stepped forward, his gaze piercing. "You failed," he said simply. Zelvor's jaw clenched. Yes. A long silence stretched between them. Then, to Zelvor's surprise, Zarkos smiled, a cold, dangerous smile. "This is interesting," the High Lord said. "Humans were meant to be weak. And yet, they wounded you, our strongest warrior." Zelvor growled, the humiliation burning in his chest. "It will not happen again." Zarkos tilted his head. "No, it won't." He waved a hand, and the door opened again. Several Zarkon scientists entered, carrying a strange, glowing black armor. It pulsed with energy, far more advanced than anything Zelvor had ever seen. "This," Zarkos said, "is the next evolution of our power. We have studied Earth's weapons, their technology, their mistakes." His eyes burned brighter. "Now we will adapt, just as they did." Zelvor stepped forward, his fingers brushing the dark armor. It felt alive, humming with untamed energy. "This will make you stronger," Zarkos continued. "You will return to Earth, and this time, you will not just conquer." His voice dropped into a whisper. "You will eradicate." Zelvor's eyes glowed brighter. This time, there would be no mistakes. This time, he would crush them all. Back on Earth, Elliot stared at the night sky, the stars barely visible beyond the Zarkon warships. He could feel it. The battle wasn't over. They would come back. And next time, it wouldn't be just Zelvor. The whole empire would come. He turned to Dr. Carter. "We don't have weeks," he said. "We need a way to fight them now." Dr. Carter hesitated. "We could try to create a prototype," she said, thinking out loud. "Something smaller, but powerful enough to weaken their defenses." Harris crossed his arms. "Even if we do, we'll need time to train soldiers, to prepare defenses." Elliot looked around at the resistance fighters. Their weapons were old, their resources limited, but there was something stronger in their eyes. Determination. They had seen the Zarkon fall once. Now, they knew they could be beaten. Elliot took a deep breath. "Then we better start now. Because when Zelvor returned, humanity would be ready." The underground base of the human resistance was buzzing with activity. Scientists worked day and night, engineers welded metal plates together, and soldiers trained tirelessly in preparation for the next battle. The victory against Zelvor had changed everything. For the first time, humanity knew that the Zarkon were not invincible. They could be hurt, their technology could be broken, and their greatest warrior could be defeated. But Elliot Carter knew one thing for sure: Zelvor would come back. And next time, he wouldn't be alone. The plan to strike back. Elliot stood in the middle of the war room, staring at a holographic display of Earth's orbit. Bright red dots marked the Zarkon warships, which still hovered like dark shadows in the sky. Commander Harris, Dr. Carter, and several other resistance leaders were gathered around. The air was thick with tension. "We don't have much time," Harris said, rubbing his chin. "Sooner or later, the Zarkon will attack again. And when they do, they won't hold back." Dr. Carter adjusted her glasses. "We've been analyzing Zelvor's broken armor, and we believe we can reverse engineer a weapon that will disrupt their energy shields." Elliot's eyes lit up. "You mean something stronger than my disruptor?" Dr. Carter nodded. "Exactly. But we need a power source strong enough to charge it." Harris sighed. That's the problem. We don't have anything powerful enough. The room fell into silence. Elliot clenched his fists. There had to be a way. He wasn't going to sit and wait for the Zarkon to wipe them out. Then an idea hit him. What about the Zarkon ships? He asked suddenly. They run on some kind of energy, right? Dr. Carter's eyes widened. Yes, if we could steal one of their power cores, we could use it to supercharge the disruptor. Harris looked doubtful. Stealing from an alien warship? That's suicide. Elliot grinned. Maybe. But it's our best shot. A risky mission. Later that night, Elliot stood outside the base, staring at the sky. The massive Zarkon warships glowed dimly in the distance, their presence like a storm cloud waiting to explode. He wasn't afraid. He had come too far to stop now. Footsteps approached from behind. Elliot turned to see Lena, one of the Resistance's best pilots. She had short black hair and a determined look in her eyes. I heard your plan, she said. You're insane. Elliot smirked. I'll take that as a compliment. Lena crossed her arms. You're really going up there? Into a Zarkon warship? Elliot nodded. If we don't, we lose this war. Lena sighed. Then you'll need a pilot. Elliot raised an eyebrow. Are you volunteering? Lena grinned. Someone has to keep you alive, genius. Meanwhile, aboard the Zarkon flagship, Zelvor stood in the center of a dark chamber, his new armor gleaming under the dim red lights. The black plates pulsed with a strange energy, and every movement felt lighter, stronger, faster. He clenched his fists. This time, there would be no mistakes. A mechanical voice echoed through the chamber. High Lord Zarkos is ready to speak. A holographic projection of Zarkos appeared before him. His yellow eyes glowed dangerously. Zelvor, he said, his voice cold, is your revenge ready? Zelvor bowed his head. Yes, my lord. The next attack will leave nothing of their resistance. Zarkos smiled cruelly. Good, but do not just destroy them. Crush their spirits. Make them know that resistance is hopeless. Zelvor straightened. I will. Zarkos nodded. We move soon. Be ready. The hologram disappeared. Zelvor looked down at his armored hands. The last battle had humbled him, but this time he would prove his true power. The humans would not survive what was coming. The heist begins. Back on Earth, Elliot and Lena climbed into a stolen Zarkon fighter ship, hidden deep in a cave near the base. Its controls were alien, its systems unfamiliar, but Lena had studied everything they knew about it. The ship's engines hummed to life, a faint blue glow lighting up the cave. Elliot took a deep breath. No turning back now. Lena smirked. Buckle up, kid. We're going to space. The ship blasted out of the cave, speeding toward the enemy fleet above. If they failed, humanity would lose its only chance at survival. But if they succeeded, the Zarkon Empire would finally have something to fear. The Zarkon warship loomed above Earth like a monstrous shadow, its metallic hull reflecting the dim light of the distant sun. Inside the stolen Zarkon fighter, Elliot and Lena sat in tense silence, their eyes locked on their target. Lena gripped the controls tightly. All right, we're approaching the docking bay, she whispered. Keep your head down. Elliot took a deep breath. Let's hope they don't scan us too closely. The stolen ship drifted toward the Zarkon mothership, blending in with a squadron of returning fighters. The massive hangar doors hissed open, and the ships glided inside. Elliot's heart pounded. One mistake, and they were dead. Inside the enemy ship, the moment the fighter landed, Lena tapped a button on the console, shutting down the engines. The hangar was filled with Zarkon soldiers, their glowing eyes scanning the ships as they arrived. Lena turned to Elliot. We need to move. Now. They slipped out of the cockpit, ducking behind a stack of metal crates. The hangar was huge, with rows of alien ships neatly lined up. Heavy footsteps echoed as Zarkon warriors patrolled the area. Elliot whispered, Where's the power core? Lena pulled out a small device and tapped the screen. A holographic map of the ship appeared. She pointed to a location deep inside. It's in the reactor chamber, 3 levels down. Elliot sighed. Of course, it's never easy. Lena smirked. Wouldn't be fun if it was. A dangerous journey. Moving stealthily, they crept through the corridors, avoiding the alien patrols. The ship's interior was cold and metallic, its walls lined with glowing red symbols. Strange humming sounds filled the air, like the ship itself was alive. They reached an elevator shaft. The main elevator had heavy security, so Lena pointed to the maintenance tunnel beside it. We climb. Elliot groaned but nodded. There was no other way. They pried open the hatch and climbed down the narrow shaft, the dim red lights casting eerie shadows. Elliot's arms burned, but he kept going. Suddenly, Lena froze. "Wait," she whispered. Elliot stopped. "What?" Lena pointed downward. Below them, 2 Zarkon engineers were standing near a control panel. If they continued, they'd be spotted. Elliot's mind raced. They couldn't turn back now. Then he noticed something, a small vent on the side. "There," he whispered. "We can crawl through." Lena sighed. "Great. More crawling." They squeezed into the tight ventilation shaft, moving carefully. It felt like forever, but finally, they reached an opening that led to a dimly lit corridor. Elliot dropped down first. Lena followed, landing silently beside him. "We're close," she said, checking the map. "Just one more door." Stealing the power core, they reached the reactor chamber, a vast circular room filled with glowing blue machinery. In the center stood the Zarkon power core, a large crystalline structure pulsing with raw energy. Elliot's eyes widened. That thing can power a whole city. Lena smirked. "And soon, it'll power our weapon." But before they could move, a deep voice echoed through the chamber. "You should not be here." Elliot spun around. Standing at the entrance was a Zarkon captain, his armor gleaming under the blue light. Lena muttered, "We're in trouble." The captain's eyes glowed. "Intruders will not leave alive." Elliot grabbed his disruptor and fired. The energy bolt hit the captain's armor, but instead of breaking, it absorbed the blast. The captain grinned. "Upgraded armor," Lena whispered. "This just got worse." The captain charged. Elliot dodged, rolling to the side as the Zarkon's massive fist slammed into the floor, leaving a deep crater. Lena fired her plasma pistol, but the energy shots bounced off uselessly. "We need to distract him," Elliot shouted. Lena tossed a smoke grenade, filling the chamber with thick white mist. In the confusion, Elliot ran to the power core and pulled out a small energy extractor from his bag. The device latched onto the core, draining a portion of its energy into a portable battery. The core flickered, and alarms blared across the ship. Lena yelled, "They know we're here." The Zarkon captain roared, swinging wildly through the smoke. Elliot barely managed to dodge, the heat from the captain's fist searing the air beside his face. Finally, the extractor finished charging. "Got it," Elliot shouted. Lena grabbed his arm. "Then let's go." The escape. They sprinted through the corridor as the ship went into lockdown. Red warning lights flashed, and metallic doors slammed shut behind them. Elliot's heart pounded. If they got trapped here, it was over. Lena pulled out a small hacking tool and pressed it against a control panel. The door ahead unlocked, just as Zarkon guards stormed after them. "They're coming," Elliot yelled. Lena grabbed his hand. "Run faster." They burst into the hangar, racing toward their stolen fighter. The Zarkon soldiers opened fire, plasma bolts sizzling past them. Elliot jumped into the co-pilot's seat, while Lena activated the engines. The fighter roared to life, lifting off the ground just as soldiers reached them. Lena grinned. "Hold on tight." The ship shot out of the hangar, dodging enemy fire as it sped toward open space. Alarms echoed through the Zarkon fleet. Warships began to turn their massive cannons toward them. Elliot's stomach twisted. We're not gonna make it. Lena smirked. Watch me. She flipped a switch, and the fighter blasted into high speed, weaving through laser fire and enemy ships. A massive explosion rocked behind them as one of the Zarkon cannons misfired, hitting a friendly ship instead. Oops, Lena said with a grin. Bad aim. Elliot laughed breathlessly. We actually did it. They broke through the atmosphere, heading toward Earth. In his hands, Elliot held the power core battery. Now they had a weapon strong enough to fight back. But deep in space, aboard the Zarkon mothership, Xelvor watched them escape. His eyes glowed with fury. This time, he growled, there will be no mercy. The resistance base was alive with excitement and urgency. Engineers and scientists rushed to install the Zarkon power core into the new disruptor weapon. Soldiers prepared for war, loading weapons and reinforcing defenses. Elliot stood in the middle of the war room, watching as the final connections were made to the disruptor cannon. This was their last hope. Lena walked up beside him, arms crossed. So, are we ready? Dr. Carter looked up from her console. Almost. The power core is integrating, but we need a few more minutes. Elliot exhaled. Let's hope we have that much time. Because deep in space, Xelvor was coming. The invasion begins. Above Earth, the Zarkon warships moved into formation, blocking out the stars like a mechanical storm, their cannons charged with deadly energy, aimed at the planet below. Inside the Zarkon flagship, Xelvor stood at the command deck, his new armor shimmering with power. His eyes burned with determination and vengeance. He raised his fist. Begin the assault. The first wave of Zarkon dropships descended upon Earth, streaking through the sky like meteors. The fight for survival. The resistance fighters took their positions, ready to defend their home. Anti-air turrets roared to life, blasting Zarkon ships before they could land. Explosions lit up the night sky. Elliot grabbed his disruptor gun and ran to the front lines. This was it. The Zarkon warriors crashed onto the battlefield, their energy weapons glowing in the darkness. The ground trembled as they charged. Lena fired from behind cover. Here they come. Elliot took aim and fired, his disruptor gun sending a pulse of energy toward an enemy soldier. The alien's shield flickered and failed. Elliot fired again, and the soldier fell. But more kept coming. The arrival of Xelvor. A massive explosion rocked the battlefield as Xelvor himself landed in the middle of the fight. His black armor pulsed with power, absorbing every attack fired at him. He marched forward, unstoppable, his red eyes locking onto Elliot. You cannot win, Xelvor declared, his voice echoing across the battlefield. Elliot gritted his teeth. We'll see about that. He fired his disruptor gun, but Xelvor deflected the blast with a swipe of his armored hand. Then, with lightning speed, the alien general lunged. Elliot barely dodged as Xelvor's fist slammed into the ground, sending a shockwave that knocked soldiers off their feet. Lena fired at him from the side, but her bullets bounced off his armor. Xelvor turned toward her, raising his arm to strike. Lena, move, Elliot shouted. But before Xelvor could attack, the ground rumbled. The disruptor cannon was ready. The ultimate weapon. Dr. Carter's voice came through the comms. Elliot, we're online. Get him into position. Elliot ran toward Xelvor, his heart pounding. He needed to lure him into the cannon's range. Xelvor charged after him, his every step shaking the ground. Elliot skidded to a stop right in front of the disruptor cannon. Come on, big guy. Let's finish this. Xelvor roared and leaped forward, his fist glowing with raw energy, ready to crush Elliot once and for all. Now, Elliot yelled. Dr. Carter fired the disruptor cannon. A blinding wave of energy exploded from the cannon, hitting Xelvor directly. His armor cracked. His body froze. He tried to move, but the energy pulse paralyzed him, sending electric currents through his armor. No, Xelvor growled. Then, with a final shattering sound, his armor broke apart, pieces falling to the ground. Elliot didn't hesitate. He raised his disruptor gun and fired the last shot, right at Selvor's chest. The alien warrior staggered. His glowing eyes flickered. Then he fell to his knees, defeated. Victory at last. The remaining Zarkon forces hesitated. Their strongest warrior had fallen. Lena grabbed a nearby radio. "Broadcast this to the enemy fleet. Let them see their leader is down." The message spread. Across the battlefield, the Zarkon began retreating. Their warships turned away from Earth, fleeing into the darkness of space. The invasion was over. Elliot stood over Xelvor, breathing heavily. The once mighty alien warrior looked up at him, his strength fading. "You are not weak," Selvor admitted, his voice barely a whisper. Elliot gave a small smile. "Took you long enough to realize." With a final breath, Xelvor collapsed, unconscious. The battlefield erupted in cheers. The humans had won. A new dawn. As the sun rose over the battered Earth, the survivors stood together, knowing they had changed history. Lena nudged Elliot. "So, what now?" Elliot looked up at the sky, where the last Zarkon ships disappeared into the void. "Now," he smiled, "we get ready, because next time, they'll know we're not weak." And somewhere in the universe, the Zarkon Empire would remember this day, the day a human child broke their strongest warrior.